One bacteria cell goes through meiosis, asexually reproduces, and makes 2 genetically identical bacteria cells. And those 2 bacteria cells go through meiosis and make a total of 4 genetically. They're genetically identical, asexual reproduction. One parent is required. Mitosis is the process. Good things about asexual reproduction: no mate is necessary, doesn't use a lot of energy. That plant can also go through asexual reproduction. I cut a stem off, stick in the soil, give it some water, it will start to grow again. It's genetically identical to the plant I cut it off. Sexual reproduction requires 2 parents. The process in which we make those sex cells is called meiosis. You are genetically different from your mom, and you are genetically different from your dad, and you're genetically different from your siblings. Unless you're an identical twin. Any identical twins in here? Then you're all genetically different than all of your siblings too. Genetic variation is a good thing. The bad thing about it is you need a mate, it takes longer. Not all organisms go through this. Genetic variation is important when we talk about survival of a species. Survival of a species, genetic variation is good. Not survival of me, survival of the human population, the human species. Because with genetic variation, it increases the likelihood that we as a human population will survive. Or any organism. I'm using us as an example. Let's say there's this really bad pandemic that goes through. Way worse than COVID. Okay? That if you get it, you automatically die. That's a really bad one, right? That'd be really bad. Okay, if everyone was genetically identical, and that started spreading throughout the population of humans, what would happen to the human population? Everyone would die, unless there were some variations within the population that for some reason or another made you resistant to it, and made that person over there resistant to it, and that person over there resistant. Some people would survive, some organisms would survive, and the species as a whole could live on. If we have some genetic variation that might make them immune to it. Okay? I think I mentioned it, there are some people who seem to be fairly immune to the HIV virus. There are some people that historically, there was villages in Europe during the Black Plague that had a higher survival rate than the neighboring villages. And looking at genetic sequencing, they believe there was a genetic mutation, a genetic variation that made them immune or relatively immune to it. So sometimes we have mutations that are good, sometimes they're bad, but genetic variation is good for survival of species. We get genetic variation through sexual reproduction, but remember, internal fertilization is not required for sexual reproduction. Which I said before, sexual intercourse, that's internal fertilization. Sexual intercourse is not required for sexual reproduction. Okay? Organisms can reproduce sexually without sexual fish, for example, frogs, for example, flowers, for example. Okay? So one way we get genetic variation in sexual reproduction is the recombination of chromosomes. Our diploid number is 46, our haploid number is 23. Our body cells have 46 chromosomes, our sex cells have 23 chromosomes. Okay? The purpose of meiosis is to produce sex cells. So when we talk about meiosis and mitosis, chromosome numbers is often a common thing. We throw 46 around a lot because it's a pretty common one that we talk about with humans. Humans have 46 chromosomes. But the idea is different organisms have different amount of chromosomes. For example, a fruit fly has 8, we have 46, a fern has 1,260. Does that mean a fern is more complex than a human? No, it's just, it has more chromosomes. It's a number. It just has a bigger number. That's all that's saying. Half the chromosomes come from one parent, half come from the other, if they're sexually reproducing organisms, which we are. So 23 of our chromosomes came from mom, 23 came from dad, assuming all parts of meiosis occurred properly. These two sets, the combination of one from mom, one from dad, we call homologous chromosomes, and we have 23 pairs of those chromosomes. Pretty fair question. That is something that we might ask is something along the lines of this chart. If a fruit fly has a diploid number of 8, how many chromosomes they have in their body cells, what would their haploid number be? Remember, haploid means half, so they'd have 4. So a fruit fly sex cells would have 4 chromosomes. Or you go the other way, a chimpanzee's haploid number is 24. What's its diploid? It'd be double, right? 48. Now it could also be worded the other way. It could say a dog, a sperm cell of a dog has 36 chromosomes. How many chromosomes would be in a skin cell of the dog? So now I'm telling you, oh, a sperm cell, that's a haploid. You have to know that's haploid. So therefore the skin, oh, that's a diploid. You'd have to double that. It's just kind of variations of questions like that. Haploids have half, diploids have double. Okay? So the idea is n versus 2n. Take this times 2 and you get this. Or you have 8 is equal to 2n, solve for n, you get 4, right? It's either double or happy. So genetic variation, sexual reproduction causes genetic variation. I've said that a bunch of times already. But within sex cells, we have genetic variation too. Throughout your life, you will produce multiple sex cells. Those sex cells will have genetic variations among them. If you were to take 2 sex cells that you produced and you were to look at all the DNA in them, they more than likely will be genetically different than the previous one. So you produce genetic variation within the sex cells that you produce, and then you take those genetic varied sex cells and then you combine them with a different sex cell for sexual reproduction to get more genetic variation. But that's why, like, you don't look the same as your brother or your sister. Because you have genetic variation because the sex cells that made you had genetic variations than the genetic variations of your siblings. And the way that we can create genetic variation within sex cells is through 2 processes called independent assortment and crossing over. So independent assortment is this idea that if this is my chromosome, I start with a diploid number of 4, I have 4 chromosomes, 2 pairs, blue came from dad, red came from mom, that when, through the process of meiosis, these homologous pairs line up, the way they line up is random and independent from the previous pair. So the idea is that if this goes, when these line up in the middle, that this goes blue-red, blue-red, this blue-red is independent of how these 2 aligned. If I flip a coin and this says blue goes here, and if I flip a coin again, that previous flip has no bearing on the next flip, right? So how this goes blue-red is random and independent than if it went red, blue, red. But these are going to produce 2 genetically different variations of sex cells. Now this is a 4 different chromosomes. We have 46, we have 23 pairs. So how many genetic variations do we have just by how those chromosomes line up? It's 2 to the 23rd power, which is a really, really, really big number. You take 2, you raise it 23rd power, and you hit equals. That's how many genetic variations of sperm cells or egg cells you alone can produce just by how these pairs line up. Okay? So statistically, you are going to create genetic variation within the sex cells that you produce. There's another way, it's called crossing over. So during prophase 1, these homologous pairs are going to match up. I call it a buddy check, and they're really close. And these 2 sister chromatids are genetically identical, and these 2 sister chromatids are genetically identical, and collectively we call this a homologous pair. Now what will happen during meiosis is these sister chromatids will separate into 2 cells, and these will separate into 2 different cells, so a total of 4 cells. Now if this were to happen, these 2 cells would be the same, and these 2 cells would be the same. We get 2 variations of sex cells, and of the 4 produced. We get 2 different variations. However, sometimes during prophase 1, we get this thing called crossing over. So because they're so close to each other, I kind of think of it like as a sword or a chopping block or whatever, and we go whack, and we chop those chromosomes at some gene. And because of how they are, we chop them, then they reattach to each other. So this was all blue, but now it's blue, and it has part of this red chromatid. This was all red, but now it's got a chunk of blue. Then what happens during meiosis is this chromatid will divide from this chromatid, and these will be 2 genetically different cells that these form. And this will form a cell, and this will form a cell, so in the end we end up with 4 genetically different cells because of something called crossing over. So the phases of mitosis, I'm not going to spend tons of time about it today because tomorrow we're going to talk about it step by step by step and we're going to draw it. The big idea of meiosis is it happens in 2 processes. We call it meiosis 1, we call it meiosis 2, but one diploid cell produces 4 haploid cells. One diploid cell, in humans, 46 chromosomes, create 4 sex cells that have 23, haploid, half the number of chromosomes. Not 100% accurate. For males, yeah, one diploid cell produces 4 viable sperm, all capable of fertilization. In female humans, one diploid cell does produce 4 haploid cells, but of those 4 haploid cells, only one of which is what we would call a viable cell, or viable egg, I'm sorry. So of those 4 haploid cells, only one of those cells can actually be an egg that is capable of being fertilized. But it happens twice. One diploid creates 4 haploid. So prophase 1, kind of similar to mitosis in the sense of the nucleus dissolved. There's some kind of key things. Buddy check, the tetrads form, we'll talk about that, crossing over can happen. Still meta, middle, middle, meta, meta, middle, but the difference between mitosis, metaphase, and metaphase 1 of meiosis is in metaphase 1, the homologous chromosomes go to the middle. The homologous chromosomes line up next to each other along the equator. Meta middle, but homologous chromosomes go to the middle. In anaphase 1, they still pull apart, but the homologous chromosomes pull apart from one another. The homologous chromosomes pull apart from one another. Then telophase, they start to pinch. But the moral, not the moral of the story, we start with 4 chromosomes in this picture. At the end of telophase, we're going to end up with 2 cells, and how many chromosomes are in this cell? Which is half what we started with, and in this one we have 2, which is half of what we started with. We start with 1 diploid, and at the end of meiosis 1 we end up with 2 haploid cells. And then those 2 haploid cells go through a process called meiosis 2, and meiosis 2 is almost identical to mitosis, where the chromosomes go to the middle in metaphase 2. The sister chromatids pull apart in anaphase 2. Then they go through, they pinch, they form cells. But we end up with 4 genetically different sex cells. We end up with 4 genetically different sex cells. And what we call these sex cells, we often refer to them as gametes. It's just a fancy way of saying sex cells. Sperm are called gametes, eggs are called gametes, and they're haploid cells. And what happens when 2 gametes come together? They restore the diploid. A haploid and a haploid make a diploid. 23 chromosomes, 46 chromosomes. So we're here today because our moms and dads, their egg and sperm cells did an F word. They fertilized each other, okay? And then they produced what we call a zygote. Just a fancy way of saying a fertilized egg. Okay, it's a fertilized egg. But we restored the diploid number. Then you were once a single cell, a fertilized egg. Then we went through mitosis and mitosis and mitosis and mitosis and mitosis and mitosis and made genetically identical cells. No identical twins in here, right? I already asked that question. You are all a result of one egg and 1 sperm combined. If you were an identical twin, you also would have been the result of 1 fertilized egg. 1 egg, 1 sperm. But what happened is early on, they divided and then they developed independent of each other, but they are genetically identical to each other. Basically, they're clones of each other. Your DNA is exactly the same. Yes, you could commit a crime and point to your sibling and say, it was them, because if you left DNA at the scene of crime, it's the exact same. I don't know why you would do that to your sibling. You really, really, really despise them, I guess.
Yeah.
You're framing them. Okay? But they're genetically identical, which must mean their genders are the same. And one of the biggest reasons I bring this up is because I have twins. I have fraternal twins. I have a boy and a girl. I have my son and my daughter, Will and Eve. And they are 2 different genders, boy, girl. So genetically, are they the same or different? They're different, right? Their DNA is different. How do you know? One's a boy and one's a girl. Okay, so they're genetically different, and they're a result of two different eggs were fertilized by two different sperm. They are siblings that were born 1 minute apart, but they're genetically as similar as if they would have been born 10 years apart. It's two separate eggs, two separate sperm. They just happen to be fertilized and grown at the same time frame. So why do fraternal twins, especially early on, look so similar? Well, look at any baby picture of you and a sibling at your 1 month or 2 months. You probably look very similar to them as well, right? We didn't have a lot of distinguishing characteristics, especially early on. You're a little baby with like a hat on. Oh, you look so cute, right? Everyone looks cute then. But fraternal twins is genetically different. They can be the same gender, but they might be different. Now, there's some kind of interesting things that go on with twins. Sometimes we have a fraternal twin, but of that fraternal, one of those eggs divided, so we actually have triplets, so we have a set of identicals and a fraternal of a triplet. That sometimes happens. Sometimes we get like octets or septuplets, okay, which is just multiples. Now, how that happens, generally they're fraternal. Generally they're fraternal. Multiple eggs were released and got fertilized and then caused this. Okay? So the idea of fertilization is they restore the diploid number by taking these sex cells, 23 and 23, make 46, and we call it a fertilized egg. Now, if I were to say, if a sperm cell has 23 chromosomes and a sperm and egg combine fertilize, how many chromosomes would be in the skin cell of that fertilized egg? It'd be 46, right? That fertilized egg then went through mitosis to form skin cells. Have a good day, everyone.